A Most Violent Year is a 2014 crime drama movie written and directed by JC Chandor that was released by A24 Films. It stars Oscar Isaac as Abel Morales, a New York City businessman who owns a heating and gas company. Jessica Chastain as Anna Morales, Abel's wife and business partner, who is alluded to have mob ties or, in the very least, connections to some form of criminal scumbags. In addition, Albert Brooks plays Andrew Walsh, Abel's attorney, and David Oyelowo plays a district attorney known simply as Lawrence. The film's plot is divided into three main components. Number 1, Abel's desire to buy a dock so that he may expand his business. Number 2, a series of hijackings that threaten both Abel's business and the health and safety of his drivers. And number 3, a looming investigation by the district attorney into Abel for unspecified white-collar crimes. The movie's title is a reference to the most violent year ever recorded in New York City history, 1981. At least, according to the publicity materials for the movie. It really just depends on how you gauge violent crime. Not to get too epistemological, but the constellation of offenses that constitute violent crime have a rather wide range. We cannot argue that crimes such as armed robbery or assault are not violent, but what exactly can be judged qualitatively as more violent versus less violent is a bit nebulous. For instance, we can agree that murder is probably one of the most serious of the violent crimes out there. However, 1981 is not the year with the most murders on record. In fact, it's not even the most murders for the 1980s. To that end, if we're purely counting the incidents of violent crime, and hypothetically there was a year with the most incidents and no murders, is that equivalent to a year where an equal amount of incidents occurred that were just all murders? Most of us would say no, I'm guessing, but why? Certainly, data is just data. However, what we choose to measure, how we choose to measure it, and how we choose to interpret the things that we measure aren't always based on rational thought. While facts may not care about your feelings do inform the facts that you care about, because we all have biases. There is no person alive that is incapable of being biased, despite someone like Sam Harris making an entire career out of such fantasies. It's part of the biological machinery that makes us what we are. The evolution that has made us has given us a lot of good things, but it also comes with its own baggage and downsides. And just remember, centrists don't really exist, at least not in the morally objective balls of floating light they wish to portray themselves as. Anyone who tries to make you believe that they somehow overcame the trappings of their own humanity, and thus all the material interest that such a transcendence implies, is a liar. Centrists, be they enlightened, radical, or whatever, are propagandists for the status quo. They are the first in the line of defense whose sole purpose is to pacify anyone who may disturb the system they benefit from by lulling any potential agents of change into inaction through complacency. So, was 1981 a most violent year? No, but certainly it was far more violent than our present. And don't get me wrong, any victim of violent crime is one too many. Perhaps one day that will never happen again, but unfortunately I don't see that ever happening in my lifetime. It may just be functionally impossible because of the intersection of competing interests inherent to living amongst other people at the scale in which we do. So, if we're just using numbers we have available, then no, 1981 is not the most violent year in New York City's history. However, statistics are not emotionally appealing, and because of that, crime can always be used as a wedge issue in contemporary politics, because it will always exist in some capacity. The only advice I can give is just weighing how useful your personal fear is against the desired economic output of the ruling class. When a member of the media or government is telling you that the GDP is more important than your life, you should definitely reevaluate your worldview. And with that, I would like to make a promise to you here. I will never hide my biases. If you have seen any of my prior videos, you would know I don't care to pretend that I'm some neutral arbiter of arts and culture who exists in some self-sustaining bubble that requires no interaction with the society around me. I'm not an objective observer. So, cards on the table, I'm an anarchist with primitivist and socialist undertones. I do not aspire for purity, so don't debate me on theory. I am, at best, a leftist, and at worst, an ally to left-leaning anti-capitalist causes. But you participate in capitalism. No, I am coerced into the system for my survival because of a mere accident of birth. Commerce is not capitalism. Work is not capitalism. Commerce and work have existed before capitalism, and they will continue to exist in a post-capitalist world. Anyone who makes broad declarations about any alternative to our current American system fostering laziness or government dependency is either a liar or stupid. Besides, the loudest voices against government handouts always seem to be the ones benefiting the most from them. So anyway, let's get to this movie. The film opens with Abel taking a morning jog in a dilapidated industrial zone set to Marvin Gaye's Inner City Blues. It makes me wanna holla the way they do my life. Okay. All right. At the same time, one of Abel's employees, Julian, played by Elias Gabel, is just starting his shift as a fuel tanker driver. This is juxtaposed with Abel meeting his wife, Anna, outside of his business with 2 suitcases of cash that Abel intends to use as a down payment for a dock that he intends to purchase so that he can expand his heating oil business. By owning the waterway and the massive storage tanks located on the property, Abel will have considerable control of the city's heating oil supply. This would allow him to not only be competitive as a vendor, but give him additional leverage over all of his competitors as a supplier. The film then shifts back to Julian on a toll road, who ends up getting carjacked by 2 brazen thugs, played by Christopher Abbott and Matthew Marr. This is also where we get the title card. After the title card rolls, Abel, with the aid of his lawyer Andrew Walsh, end up making the down payment on the dock and sign a covenant with its current owner, Joseph Mendelson, played by Jerry Adler. The covenant states that Abel would pay the remaining $1.5 million in 30 days, which is solid from a writing standpoint. We have established stakes now. I mean, what could go wrong in 30 days? Abel's business is flourishing, he just moved his family into a McMansion in the suburbs. What could possibly complicate his charmed life? For starters, we learn immediately that Abel has been under investigation for some unspecified financial crimes for the last 2 years. This is revealed when Abel goes to District Attorney Lawrence's office to complain about the spate of hijackings that has been affecting his business. This is also where we get one of the running themes of the film, and that is the incompetence of law enforcement.
So you guys have done what you needed to?
Yeah.
So what is it that you've done?
I'm not exactly sure. I just got here at 4. My shift's actually up, so...
District Attorney Lawrence, played by David Oyelowo, expresses that he lacks any concern for Abel's troubles. Because of the logistics involved with moving such large amounts of fuel, coupled with the demand for such a commodity, D.A. Lawrence surmises that the hijackings can only be perpetrated by one of his competitors. The heating oil companies are always ripping off the customer, D.A. Lawrence says, and therefore, there's some measure of justice now that they are just ripping each other off. It is also during this meeting that D.A. Lawrence does Abel a courtesy by letting him know that his office will soon be bringing charges against Abel. While it's never a good time to be charged with a crime, the specific timing of the impending indictment threatens to imperil Abel's ability to raise the remaining $1.5 million he needs in order to buy the Bayside terminal for which he has already placed a down payment. The charges make Abel toxic to any potential lenders, which is a conceit of the movie that is somewhat hard to believe. Banks do have legal obligations to know their customer, but the reality is a little bit more complicated. Because of the nature of banking, bankers have every incentive to look the other way, regardless of legality. If there's money to be made, there's money to be made. Not to say that they are entirely to blame. We have feckless institutions that just skim the illicit profits of any criminal enterprises or wrongdoing in the form of fines and fees. Rather than act with the full authority of their offices, government agencies like the Department of Justice and the Securities Exchange Commission often fail to mete out anything resembling justice. This creates a cottage industry for said agencies where banks and financial institutions are allowed to routinely break the law with little to no consequence, as long as they share in some of the profit. On top of all that, it's considered deeply un-American to prosecute and punish wealthy people, for reasons that are definitely rational and not at all based on dumb superstition. One night, while Anna and Abel are in bed, they are woken by a stirring in their new home. Abel notices a young man outside of his front door trying to break in. Abel chases him away with the baseball bat. Anna suspects that this has something to do with the recent hijackings, but Abel seems assured that it's just a random act. The following day, Anna finds one of her and Abel's daughters playing with a gun she found just outside the front door of their home. Anna then presents the gun angrily to Abel, before hypothesizing that the would-be thief was actually a would-be murderer. And I'll go ahead and try to tie this small thread up now. It's left kind of ambiguous, though Anna's theory is delivered with such certainty that the audience is supposed to be convinced by it, but the film never actually answers the question. People get robbed with guns all the time. It's not a good thing, but the introduction of a gun is not a confirmation of intent. Fed up with the hijackings and the probable threat to his life, Abel weighs his options. In doing so, he decides to meet with the union representative for his drivers, Bill O'Leary, played by Peter Garrity, who suggests arming the drivers and giving them fraudulent handgun permits as to cut through the red tape involved with getting legitimate paperwork. Abel doesn't like the idea, deeming it to be too risky from both a legal and safety standpoint. From this point on, the audience is let in on the internal conflict that Abel Morales will struggle with throughout the duration of the film, which is, how does Abel maintain his moral integrity in a corrupt world? And in order to answer this question, or rather address it within the framework of the film's messaging, we need to understand a few things. Remember how I stated earlier in this video that it is impossible to be objective? Perspective permeates and colors everything we do. While I can't say how JC Chandor politically identifies, I can say with full confidence that he makes conservative films. And that's not an insult, nor is it an indictment. Conservative artists do exist, and I think it's perfectly fine to enjoy films with conservative values. I was born in the 80s, and so most of my formative years in the 90s was spent watching action films which were all inspired by Reagan-era war on drugs / tough on crime politics, or the constant revenge fantasy that the American political class had, and to be honest, still have, about erasing the loss of the Vietnam War and the cultural shame it created. Oh, and just a lot of anxiety about the Cold War as well. I'm no stranger to enjoying films with conservative points of view. The only difference is I'm aware of the constant hell that living in a world ruled by conservative values is actually like compared to the fantasy presented by films with conservative messaging. That being said, this film is, to its core, a conservative film. Not particularly the cuckoo bananas MAGA brain rot that is now considered mainstream conservatism. I mean the neoliberal New York country club conservatism for which greed is its only consistent value. Think Patrick Bateman from American Psycho. That kind of conservatism. It's the kind of conservatism that is willing to do anything and work with anyone as long as it increases net worth or shareholder value. Think rainbow capitalism. Think girl boss capitalism. Think any adjectival noun plus capitalism. It isn't encumbered by any codified set of morals nor principles because it is a celebration of individualism, and every person has their own code. The only constant goal that binds all these disparate credos and moral codes is the desire to hoard as much money and power as possible. So, with all this in mind, when the film asks, how does Abel maintain his moral integrity in this corrupt world? It isn't asking about a coherent set of principles that we can identify. It's asking in terms of the moral code he has developed in his own head. After all, Abel seems credibly accused of financial crimes and does nothing in the film to actually refute the allegations. As Frank Wilhoit stated so elegantly, conservatism consists of exactly one proposition, to wit, there must be in-groups whom the law protects but does not bind, alongside out-groups whom the law binds but does not protect. When viewing a film with conservative messaging, it's important to keep this in mind, and it will easily explain why conservative protagonists have no issue with hypocrisy, so long as it advances their own personal interest. It also explains why, in real life, hypocrisy amongst conservatives is not only tolerated, but embraced. For conservatives, hypocrisy is not a sign of immorality or some sort of character flaw. It's considered a privilege that can only be exercised by a special few. Furthermore, JC Chandor is the son of an investment banker. From what I can tell through his films, this has deeply shaped the way he sees the world. His breakout film Margin Call in 2011, starring Zachary Quinto, Stanley Tucci, and Kevin Spacey, is basically a defense of the financial industry, even as it melts down into the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. There's even this weird part where Paul Bettany, who plays a trader named Will Emerson, gives a convoluted speech about how he made $2.5 million the year before and how that is actually not that much money, and if the audience could just see it from his perspective, his plight is basically equal to the millions of working class Americans that he and other bankers like him are about to screw over. Later that night, Abel seeks guidance by an industry peer named Peter, played by Alessandro Nivola. When we meet Peter, he's hitting balls in an indoor tennis court located on his estate, and we learn that in their brief conversation that he, like Abel's wife Anna, has either mob ties or some connection to the underworld. We also learn that Peter has dealt with similar issues with his own company, and has chosen to simply just retreat to his palatial estate. He calls it a fortress, but it reads more like a gilded cage. Sure, Peter is unfathomably wealthy, but that wealth comes at a cost of making very dangerous enemies to the point where he's simply too scared to practice his tennis swing outside in the open air, even on his own property. With news of Abel's eventual indictment spreading, Andrew Walsh decides to do some damage control by setting up a dinner with a banker named Arnold Lewis, played by John Procaccino. Abel spends the dinner assuring Arnold that his legal troubles are vastly overblown, and that the bank can and should continue to give him money, because they both like money, and Abel's real estate purchase is yet another opportunity for both of them to get more of said money, which is something they both like and want more of. This is convincing enough, and Arnold gives assurances that the bank will stick by Abel and give him that sweet, sweet cash that he can never get enough of. After the dinner, Abel and Anna hit a deer on a dark, empty stretch of highway. Noticing that the deer has survived the initial collision with their car, Anna advises Abel to put the deer out of its misery. Abel finds a tire iron in his trunk, but he is too hesitant to act. Frustrated with his delay, Anna shoots the deer multiple times in one of the more blatant disregards for gun safety that I have ever seen on film in a while. Which, as another digression, if you've never handled a firearm before and you find yourself in a position to do so, just use caution. Make sure you develop familiarity with how to operate it safely, in the very least. I'm not against gun ownership. I grew up around guns, and I do enjoy shooting them, but I'm also not one of those absolutists when it comes to the Second Amendment. I'm not blind to how easily they can be accessed without any sort of show of skill or competency. Bullets can do crazy things once they leave a gun, and the chance of one of them ricocheting and injuring Abel or Anna is not a non-zero chance. In fact, I actually had a classmate growing up who became permanently disabled both mentally and physically because he was running around with a handgun trying to shoot a snake on the ground, or that was the story. It wouldn't surprise me, just because that sounds like normal, dumb, teenage kid shit where I'm from. The bullet hit something on the ground, ricocheted into his head, and he was never the same again. From then on, he was confined to a wheelchair, he could no longer speak clearly, and he was transferred to special education classes for the remainder of our junior high and high school years. Anna's gun ownership, which was unknown to Abel until this point, causes an argument between the two. And though I have no basis for this assertion, I feel it is JC Chandor's country club conservatism bleeding through. While the American news media likes to portray all Republicans as gun-obsessed nutjobs, this is actually an oversimplification of the politics surrounding guns. There is a strain of upper-middle-class, elite institution Republicans who've never handled a firearm in their entire life that are equally as scared of them as the media trope of a bleeding-heart suburban liberal. However, Abel's concern for Anna's gun seems to have very little to do with the inherent dangers it presents as much as he thinks it makes her look quote-unquote low-class, which I feel strengthens my previous assertion about the writer and director of this film. The Wall Street Republican type that JC Chandor reads as to me, through his filmmaking at least, is one who knows that he has made an uneasy alliance with armed religious extremists for the sake of low taxes. Guns aren't for a guy like Abel, and by extension Chandor, because they are tools of an underclass whose only purpose is to serve as enforcers of their agenda. Anyway, having recovered from the injuries he received from the initial hijacking in the film's opening, Julian returns to work. Rightfully, he is scared to do so, and in a few scenes prior, while he was still in recovery, he expressed his desire to switch from working as a driver to doing sales. Though, this change in career is quashed by Abel, who feels Julian is unsuited for such work. In any case, the audience is shown that working as a heating oil salesman is no less dangerous. One of Abel's sales reps, played by Ben Rosenfield, is physically assaulted on the job for trying to make a sale in a part of town that is considered to be the territory of one of Abel's competitors. As Julian returns to work, he is targeted by the same thugs that hijacked him before. And strangely, the two men are given first and last names in IMDb despite never once having their names mentioned in the film at all, nor are they given enough depth to even warrant it. This took me down a strange path, as it seems David Oyelowo plays a far greater role in the movie, and yet his character doesn't even have a full name. It just made me deeply curious as to how and why JC Chandor chooses to give characters full names or not, and hopefully one day somebody will ask him about this, because I'm very, very curious. During the second hijacking of Julian's truck, we learn that he has now armed himself against the wishes of Abel. He manages to fend off the attackers, but it's a Pyrrhic victory. As the police sirens draw closer, Julian, who not only has fired shots recklessly in a public space, is also now in possession of an illegal handgun. As this dawns on him, he flees the scene with one of the hijackers, as they now both have a mutual interest in avoiding the police. Word of the incident travels fast and jeopardizes Abel's financing, because somehow Arnold Lewis is the one banker ever in the history of banking who actually cares about due diligence. With financing now having fallen through, Abel is in a race with the clock to fulfill his obligations per the covenant that he signed at the beginning of the film. His initial approach is to find Julian and get him to surrender to the police so that he can restore the company's image in the eyes of the bank. After some legwork, he is able to deliver Julian to the police, but Julian at the last minute has a change of heart and decides to just run from the cops. It's yet another jab at police incompetency that can be found throughout this movie, but like I stated before in another video, my review and analysis of Pacific Heights, conservative critiques of the police and the justice system writ large is that the police are too restricted by the law to effectively do the job that conservatives want them to do, which is to react with deadly force at their earliest convenience. With Julian now on the run, Abel is forced to find other ways to finance his purchase of the Old Bay Front Terminal. He does manage to make up the $1.5 million shortfall by the end of the film, through a series of loans, blackmail, and a Deus Ex Machina courtesy of Anna Morales' unscrupulous bookkeeping. Not all of these are that interesting to examine in depth, but I will take some time to describe how Abel is able to come up with the $1.5 million for the sake of thoroughness. The first loan comes from a competitor that we learned that Abel had once attempted to buy out. But with the tables now being turned, Abel was forced to accept a loan with very unfavorable terms that will see him wholesaling fuel to them for the next 5 years. The second loan is the result of a mortgage that Abel takes out on an apartment complex that he jointly owns with his much younger brother, Elias, who is played by Pico Alexander. This loan, too, is considered unfavorable, and it's even noted by Elias as being a quote-unquote sucker loan. After securing Elias' signature for the mortgage, Abel coincidentally finds that he is in the perfect place to chase down one of his fuel trucks as it's being hijacked. After hearing a distress call on his company's two-way radio, he decides to take the matter into his own hands because, the conservative fantasy of vigilante justice. However, I will note that this film is rather restrained. It's billed as a crime drama, but it's far more subdued than such a label suggests. I will say it lacks a lot of the satisfying moments that you would normally see in movies of this genre. Given the critical praise it's received, I know some will defend it as being cerebral or a slow burn, but that just wasn't my experience of it. Anyhow, this leads to a car chase that devolves into a foot chase where Abel eventually successfully nabs Louis Servito, a name I might add is never said in the film itself. This is the thug played by Christopher Abbott, and he doesn't really appear on the screen any longer than 6 minutes or so, and yet his character has a first and last name for reasons I will never not find puzzling. Oh, and the other thug, Lewis's partner, his name is John Dominchik. He's the guy that's played by Matthew Marr. And again, his name is never said in the movie. I don't know why he has a first and last name. But he dies during the car chase. And during the chase, nothing really of note happens. They just go through this tunnel, and then the fuel truck turns over, and John just doesn't survive the crash. After catching Lewis, Abel is able to beat some information out of him. And while Lewis claims he doesn't work for anyone but himself, he is able to give Abel enough information for him to figure out which of his competitors has been stealing from him. And we learn that it is Arnold Klein, played by Glenn Fleshler, that is stealing from Abel, because, of course it is. Any show or film with a modicum of mystery that Glenn Fleshler is in, he's the guy who did it, because those are just the rules. Now knowing who the fuel thief is, Abel uses the information to extort money from Arnold Klein by threatening to report the thefts to the federal authorities. However, Abel is still short $600,000, and this is where the Deus Ex Machina comes in. Having nowhere else to turn, Abel approaches Peter for a loan for the final $600,000. Peter makes the point that he's connected to the mob, and he's not someone that Abel would ever want to owe money to. The terms of the loan are never discussed, but there is enough mob tropes about loan sharking in American culture that we're kind of able to fill in the gaps. Abel doesn't necessarily seem shaken by the terms, but he discusses his dissatisfaction with it to Anna, who then writes down an account number that contains all the money that Abel would ever need. Anna suggests that he can immediately pay back Peter to get out from under the loan. A small argument erupts, but Abel accepts the embezzled funds, with an assurance from Anna that she can use her bookkeeping to make the money look legitimate. With all the money necessary to finalize the purchase, Abel, Anna, and Andrew Walsh go to the terminal to sign some paperwork and celebrate the closing of the deal. As they look into the East River, Abel is confronted with a gun-wielding Julian. After some back and forth with Abel, Julian eventually turns the gun on himself, but not before the film's message is fully conveyed. In Julian's final moments, he asks Abel if he was given a better chance than most, to which Abel replies that Julian was just given a fair chance. Conservatives, or rather conservative media, has a fascination with trying to disprove the existence of privilege, because it insulates their egos from ever having to acknowledge that the circumstances in their lives may not be the result of effort or merit. It's also a way to quell any systemic critiques. If everyone's circumstances matches the output of the effort they put into the world, then there's nothing to fix. There's no reason to ever complain. And yes, I get the irony of that. I do understand it's a little bit incoherent because conservatives love complaining ad nauseum, but reactionary sentiments are not fixed. They live in the moments that are most convenient for the person experiencing them. It's no accident that JC Chandor made the characters Abel and Julian immigrants. This gives him license to contrast the outcome of their lives in America, because in his conception, this means that both characters are starting from a neutral position. However, the immigrant experience is not universal. Not everyone who immigrates to the US does so with just the clothes on their backs. It's a fairy tale that Americans love to tell themselves, but the reality is a bit more complicated. We don't know how either man got to this country, and under what circumstance. We don't even know which country they are from, or even if they're from the same country. But in the mind of JC Chandor and conservatives like him, Julian's failures are as self-inflicted as the bullet hole in his head. He was given a fair chance, same as everyone else. In the film's final moments, D.A. Lawrence shows up with the police as they process the scene. As they wait for the area to clear, Lawrence mentions that Abel's new acquisition will bring him more money and power, while implying that such influence can be used in Abel's favor. Abel in turn tells D.A. Lawrence that he has always strived to do what is most right. While it might be possible to read this final line as Abel acquiescing to the corrupt world around him, and thus compromising his own moral code and accepting the price of power and success to be corruption, we must remember that the film's core message is a conservative one. The conservative worldview is a Manichaean one where the world is divided along the lines of good and evil. In conservative films, the protagonists can be flawed in a number of ways. This is why a lot of conservative protagonists are usually anti-heroes themselves, at least in the mainstream culture. For this particular case, I'm going to exclude Christian films, though there are some consistencies between protagonists that are in explicitly Christian films versus secular ones. Anyway, anti-heroes don't need to be paragons of virtue to serve the greater good. A conservative protagonist is one that fulfills their most selfish desires by any means necessary. They act as avatars for the audience's darkest desires and gives them the permission to celebrate things that they would find objectionable if done by anyone else. Goodness in the conservative sense is not a matter of deed. It's not something that can truly ever be earned. It's something assigned to them by a higher power that can never be undone. Because of this, anti-heroes do not need to exercise any form of restraint. We already instinctually know they are good. They are presented to us in a way that makes us empathize with them. And there's no possibility that someone like us could ever like someone who is not good, right? It's because of this familiarity that conservative protagonists are never put into positions where they must grow or change, and any misfortune that may befall them is just the doing of a corrupt world. There's nothing for them to learn because they were right all along, and the world around them only has two choices to make: to get on their level or to cut them down. Well, that's it, like, subscribe, or something. I don't know. Do whatever.